All right, so you can see right now that we have a blank page. Now the first thing I want to do is add a very simple panel to this called Canvas. Canvas is a panel that gives you standard XY coordinate positioning. I'm also going to add one child to the canvas, and we'll just add an ellipse. An ellipse is a simple element that just draws an ellipse on the screen. Okay, so you can see that I've created that ellipse, and it's 100 by 100 pixels big, and I added it as a child of the canvas. And by the way, if there ever were an appropriate time to use the color tomato, it would be for this, because that looks exactly like a tomato. In fact, it would look even more like a tomato if we made the height 80. So not too much layout is actually happening here, but we do see the ellipse. Now to get the canvas to position the ellipse, we need to give it top and left coordinates. And we're going to do that using a really cool concept called attached properties. So I'm going to set some attached properties directly on the ellipse. All right, so real quickly, let me do something in XAMLPad to make this text a little bit easier to read. I'm going to go ahead and change the font size to improve the readability of the text. I can do that using this drop-down at the top of XAMLPad. Okay, so now you should be able to see that I've set these two properties. The first is canvas.top, and I set that to 100, and I set the other canvas.left to be 200. And that had the effect of positioning the ellipse within the context of the canvas. Now you can tell that these properties are attached properties because the properties themselves are prefixed with the canvas dot notation. Now that's an indication to us that the property was defined by the canvas element. Attached properties give Canvas the ability to do something really cool, to define properties that can be used on other elements. The ellipse itself doesn't actually need to know about the top and the left properties. They're defined by the canvas, and then they get used on the ellipse. So attached properties are really, really common within panels because it's very common that the panel will want to set arbitrary properties on its children and then interpret those properties for determining how those children should be laid out. So notice that when I set those properties, the ellipse moved to the new location just as expected. Now we can also add another child to the canvas as well, and we'll position that one accordingly. So let's go ahead and copy this first line. So you can use Control-C to copy and Control-V to paste it. And now let's change some property values on that line. Okay, so now we have officially completed our portrait of a tomato. And notice that these objects get placed in the panel in the order that they were defined. So if I were to move the smaller ellipse above the larger one, you wouldn't be able to see it anymore because it would essentially fall behind the big one. So let's move it by copying the second line and pasting it above the first one. Now notice that the little gold ellipse has disappeared. Now that's what happens by default. Items get laid out in the order that they're defined. But if you really want to control that, you actually can do that with another attached property. This is one that's defined directly by the panel property, and it's called panel.z-index. This lets you set the z-index of the elements. Notice that this is also an attached property. So let's go ahead and set panel.z-index to be 1 on the smaller ellipse. So you can see how that brought that smaller ellipse back up to the top. With the z-index property, higher numbers mean that the object is closer to the front relative to any other object inside that panel. The default value for the z-index property is 0, so any positive number here would have worked for the z-index property. It would have placed that smaller ellipse on top of the big one. So Canvas, of course, is a really, really simple panel, and it's great if you already know how much space your content is going to occupy, and if you don't plan on moving the content around that much. There are a lot of situations, though, where you want the panel to adapt to either the content or to the space that's available to it. Also, Canvas does a really good job positioning its content, but notice that we had to specify the content size. There are panels that will handle that, or at least partially handle the sizing for you.